Before we launch into this presentation, I'm Azim. You've probably all seen me by now, probably sick of my face, but here we are. So before we go into I'll introduce Nathan and talk a little bit about this lecture itself. A few housekeeping bits and pieces. Certificates are available per webinar that you guys attend. So please fill out your feedback form right end, and then our friends at Medigate will offer you a certificate. So please keep an eye on your emails and also your junk email as well. Please join our Facebook group, Biomedicine for Students. This is where we release all of our up-to-date webinar details and schedules, etc., and on Instagram as well, at Biomedicine. So I think those are all the housekeeping bits I had to do, but yeah. Cool, so let's dive in. Welcome everyone to Biomedicine's 47th webinar. Time has flown by. I can't believe it's July. It's a little bit crazy. And this webinar today on a Friday evening, so it's fantastic that you're all here, is Collapse on the Street, What to Do Next. Now, out of all the webinars we've done, this is probably going to actually be the most relevant to your day-to-day life. I think it's something we can all relate to. We might not have seen someone collapse on the street, but if it does happen, hopefully this fantastic webinar by Nathan will sort you guys out. So let me quickly introduce Nathan. I'm sure he's going to tell you a little bit more about himself anyway, but Nathan is a great friend of the Biomedicine team. He has done a previous webinar on high altitude emergencies, which was absolutely fantastic. He himself is an expedition doctor. He's traveled all around the world in a medical capacity. He works in A&E, he's worked in intensive care. So he's an absolutely fantastic guy. And thank you so much for joining us today, Nathan. We're honored to have you here. Thank you for giving up your time. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you so much, Azim, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back. I just wanted to say, if anyone did miss my last lecture, it was on high altitude emergencies a few weeks ago. It was the first one I'd done with biomedicine, and I must say it's a pretty terrifying experience talking to 200 and something number of people when you're in a room by yourself. But if you did miss it and you're interested, I've put the link to the recording of the webinar in my bio. My Instagram is just at the top there, at expedition_doctor. And so coming on to today's talk, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a background on myself, just so that you know why I'm talking about this, why I'm interested in this. So firstly, I'm, as Azim already mentioned, I work in A&E. I'm currently on a junior clinical fellow job in intensive care, and I also work as an expedition doctor. So for those of you who don't know what an expedition doctor is, it is someone who goes on expeditions all around the world to provide medical care in case something goes wrong. But not just that, it's all about the preparation, risk management, screening participants, preparing the medical kit, taking charge of things like water safety and hygiene when you're on expedition, as well as dealing with any emergencies that might arise. It's an absolutely incredible job, and I thoroughly recommend it to everyone. Like, if you haven't thought about it already and you're an outdoorsy type person, then definitely have a think about it. And if you have any questions about what it is to be an expedition doctor or how to get involved, then just drop me a message on Instagram. I'll be very happy to reply. If you don't hear back from me, just fire me another message. I always try and get back to everyone, but occasionally I do miss messages. So yeah, so why am I talking today though on, let me switch sides. Here we go. So yeah, why am I talking today about essentially pre-hospital emergencies that catch you off guard when you're not in the hospital setting? Essentially, when I was a medical student, I was really interested in pre-hospital emergency medicine. I founded the Cambridge University Emergency Medicine Society, and I did both of my student selected component blocks with the air ambulance. The first one was with Magpass Helimedics, which is an air ambulance charity in the east of England. And the second one was with Essex and Herts Air Ambulance. And this is just, I mean, I couldn't resist putting a picture of a helicopter in. So there is a picture of a helicopter when I was on my SSC as a final year. And to anyone who was watching my last lecture, I'm very sorry, but there aren't any questions where the answer is call a helicopter this time. So sorry to disappoint. So I became very interested in pre-hospital emergency medicine. And as part of that interest, myself and a few other people were involved in setting up something called the Cambridge Student and Community First Responder Scheme. And that was essentially designed to facilitate early bystander CPR and early response to medical emergencies in the community in the parts of Cambridge where actually maybe there weren't so many ambulances so readily available. So we actually founded this in conjunction with the Cambridge Ambulance Service. We had our own car, which was the Community First Responder car, and we would essentially go on call and we would drive around the city and wait for any calls. And then if there was one, we would have to drive not under blue light, so you know, very calmly signaling traffic and everything, to the emergency and hope we beat the ambulance there and could do something useful. So that was where my interest in all of this pre-hospital stuff came about. Why am I qualified to talk about it? So in my expedition medicine role, I'm often dealing with people who do collapse in front of you. Often you're not, well, obviously you're not in a hospital environment, and sometimes it can take you off guard. For example, this guy who had high altitude cerebral edema, we ended up evacuating with a reduced GCS, reduced oxygen level, so ataxic he couldn't even stand up. And this deterioration had happened over the space of about 45 minutes, prior to which he was completely normal, fit and well, you know, just having some breakfast. So it can catch you off guard. So I've had a bit of experience managing unexpected collapses. And also I am a advanced life support instructor as of a few weeks ago. So that's quite fun as well. Here's just another example. I couldn't resist putting in some expedition photos. I know it's kind of not exactly relevant, but anyway, couldn't resist. So I hope you enjoy them. This is a photo I took in northern Pakistan on the Gondogorla Pass, up at nearly 5,600 meters. When again, the person in front of me, you can see just down at the bottom right there, had a collapse. So you might have seen on my Instagram, I was posting about this story that happened. And so I thought I'd tell you a bit more about it. It was 4 years ago in Cambridge, summer. We were coming up to our final exams. My housemate, Doug, on the left there, he'd been running in the Cambridge Half Marathon. It was an absolutely beautiful day. The sun was shining, and Doug put in an incredibly impressive time, especially considering he'd been out boozing the night before. And we were then just waiting by the finish line for another one of our friends to end the race. And then while we were standing there, we suddenly heard a bit of a commotion, and literally about 3 meters away from us, someone had collapsed, and an event first aider had run up to them, and they were just about to start doing CPR, at which point Doug and I were like, oh my God, like we're doing this community first responder thing. You know, we're literally standing there, like there's absolutely no way we can justify not helping. And we can come on to talk a bit about that later. So anyway, we got there, the first aider doing CPR. I don't think had ever done CPR before, but it certainly wasn't the best CPR, but it's better than nothing. So it's absolutely the right thing that they started. Anyway, so then I took over, Doug applied the defibrillator, and we were actually going on that person for about 10 minutes until we eventually got a return of spontaneous circulation, or we got a ROSC. And it was an absolutely amazing moment, because most of the time when you go to a cardiac arrest in the community or in hospital, they often don't get a ROSC. And so it was really quite an incredible moment when they got a ROSC. But even more mind-blowing is that pretty much at that exact moment, literally 100 meters, just the other side of the line, someone else collapsed. And I said to Doug, you know, you go over there, I'll just make sure he's all right, because the ambulance was just arriving for this guy. And Doug got over there, started applying defibrillator because he was in cardiac arrest, at which point I ran over there and started CPRing him as well. And he actually had a ROSC after one shock. And it was amazing. It was, you know, the survival rate for out of hospital cardiac arrest is less than 1 in 10. And here were two men, both in their, I think they were 30s and early 40s, who had an out of hospital cardiac arrest, who had a ROSC before the ambulance arrived and were taken to hospital. And it was really weird because the rest of that day, life kind of just went on as normal. They were whisked off to hospital. Doug and I sort of caught up with our other friend who finished the race by now. And yeah, we went to the pub that evening and didn't really think much of it. It was only a few days later, Doug and I were chatting. I was like, wow, like that was really quite an experience. And I thought, okay, well, I'm in hospital today. I was going to Adam Brooks. So I thought I'd see if I could find them, see if they were in there still. And I did. I found both of them. One of them was on the neurocritical care. Oops, sorry. One was on the neurocritical care unit, and the other one had been stepped down to the ward. And I was like, wow, like he's on the ward. He's doing really well. And in my mind, I was expecting that to be the guy who was only down for sort of a minute or two. But it turned out it was the guy who'd been down for more than 10 minutes. And I went to visit him on the ward and had a chat with him. And his wife was there. And she just burst into tears and, you know, saying thank you. And they were telling me about their young kids, and it was just the most unbelievable feeling. Like, I cannot describe it. It's unlike anything else I've had in medicine, just feeling like some degree of personal responsibility for actually saving a life. And it's this kind of glorified concept that we all think about as medics, but very rarely actually feel some sort of personal responsibility. And it wasn't obviously just me and Doug. There were a couple of other people who stopped to help out as well. So yeah, it was an amazing feeling though. And it was quite bizarre. They were both very similar age, both had young kids. Both of them had put in 15 minutes better than their previous PB, personal best. And yeah, it was quite an incredible experience. And so from that point, I became much more interested in pre-hospital or out of hospital cardiac arrest and the things that lead to an enhanced rate of survival, and the fact that actually the UK does not very well at doing bystander CPR when it comes to out of hospital cardiac arrest compared to some other countries. And I think the UK is starting to move towards a slightly better standpoint in that it's being CPR training is being incorporated into the education system soon, and so we're making steps in the right direction. And there's some various education campaigns run by the Resource Council, such as I think it's Starter Heart. I'll come on to it a bit later anyway. So it's a really, really interesting topic, and I thought it was useful to maybe talk about it today because it can happen to anyone. And the biggest assumption that everyone makes is they think, oh, it won't happen to me. You know, I'm never there when someone collapses. There's always someone else there. But the reality is it can happen to anyone. It could happen to a family member. It could happen to a friend. It could happen to someone just out and about. And actually looking back at my own life over the last few years, there's been quite a number of times now where I've come across something where I've had to stop and help. I've driven past a moped accident. I've driven past a car where it was turned upside down on my way to work. I've been there on the tube station where someone's collapsed on the platform. I don't know if I'm a bit of a shit magnet or something, but it seems to happen. So, you know, it can happen to anyone when you least expect it. So today I'm not going to really focus too much on statistics and, you know, drugs and, you know, like nitty-gritty details that you need to remember. I just want to give you a bit of background and a bit of a toolkit that will hopefully help you feel confident enough to deal with these situations, and hopefully give you a bit of an idea of how to deal with these situations. Because the reality is, if you experience someone collapsing in a hospital, it's kind of a bit more expected, and there's a set algorithm you go through and everyone turns up to help. And it's less adrenaline inducing. Whereas when it happens outside of hospital, suddenly it's a whole different ballgame. You know, everything you know and you're familiar with goes out the window. You can't remember anything, and you've got maybe people screaming, maybe not, maybe other people are just being like, you know, who's here? Is there a doctor around? And you're thinking, oh my God, I need to help. And the adrenaline goes through the roof. And so it's really, really, really important if you're in these situations to remember that you can just go back to basics. You always just go back to basics. And hopefully what I'm going to remind you of today and maybe teach you is just some of these basic tools that you can use if you ever find yourself in this situation. Cool. So that's a little bit of an introduction. Very embarrassingly, but I thought I'd put it anyway. I ended up on the front page of the Cambridge newspaper with my housemate Doug on that, which was quite fun. So I'm just going to set the scene with a few quick case scenarios. These are situations which you could very easily find yourself in, and I've had one or two of these similar situations myself in the past. So these hopefully will just provide a bit of a framework for you to frame your thoughts throughout the rest of this lecture. So the first case, imagine you're doing a shop at the supermarket, you're just getting some beers, go down to the park later, and then you hear a loud thud, and it's an elderly man who is standing next to you, looking at the milk aisle or whatever, and he's just collapsed. What do you do? So that's the first case. The second one, we think about, I'm sure many of you have been in this situation, and it's when you're walking down the street and you see someone who appears to be homeless, you see him unconscious, they're face down in an awkward position, you're running a bit late for work. Do you stop to check he's okay? And I'll put my hand up now and say I've definitely been in situations like that where I haven't stopped. Doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, and I'm sure there are lots of people here who also have been in a similar situation. Third case, you're driving down a country lane, and as you go around the corner, you have to slam on the brakes because you've seen a cyclist lying in the road having come off their bicycle. What do you do next? And the last case, oh no, just three, sorry, that was the last case. So just wanted to move on to then talk about why it's important that we talk about this thing. Why is it important that we consider this as an issue? And the main reason is because if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. So you never know when it might happen. It might be that you go out this evening. It might be if you go to the pub tomorrow. Woo! You never know when it might happen. So unless you actively prepare by running through what you might do in these situations in your mind, such as by turning up to tonight's lecture, if you don't do that, when you're in the situation, you're relying on some sort of superhuman instinct and the adrenaline rush that comes with it. And actually people will make mistakes and won't act in the best way. And it's important because out of hospital cardiac arrest in particular, so I'll split it into two parts, cardiac arrest and non-cardiac arrest. But out of hospital cardiac arrest has abysmal survival rates because bystanders aren't very good at doing CPR, aren't very good at starting CPR, I should say, and because AEDs aren't used enough. So the out of hospital cardiac arrest survival rates in the UK are roughly 5%. That's 1 in 20 people who has an out of hospital cardiac arrest will survive. However, if there's bystander CPR, that number quadruples. So just by the fact that there is someone who is standing there who witnesses the collapse, recognizes they're in cardiac arrest and starts doing chest compressions and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, or even just compressions only, then we'll come on to that. That can quadruple the survival chance. And then once you factor in public use of an automatic external defibrillator, or an AED, which are found in every tube station in London, lots of schools, lots of shopping malls, they're all over the place. If you have early use of an AED, that survival rate goes up to as much as 70%. So that's the difference between someone has a cardiac arrest and no one does anything about it, they've got a 1 in 20 chance of survival, to someone does some CPR and there's an AED that gets used quickly, and that survival rate can go up to almost 70%. And the Resource Council website quotes 50 to 70%, depending on the study that you read. So that's why it's really, really important. And I've just put a summary of those statistics right there just to emphasize that. So no CPR, 1 in 20, bystander CPR, quadruple it, bystander CPR and AED, and the survival goes up to 70%. But what if it's not a cardiac arrest? Why is it important we talk about it? So the reason I want to talk about it is because when someone doesn't have a cardiac arrest, they collapse. You're in a slightly strange situation as a medic, because you have a little bit of medical knowledge. Maybe you have a lot of medical knowledge, but you aren't in your familiar environment. And so there's a danger that comes with being a medic, that you actually say something's benign when actually maybe it isn't, because a collapse isn't just one event. A collapse might be just one event, and might just be a benign, sort of harmless vasovagal episode, or a faint because they're quite dehydrated and they've been standing up for a long time, for example, on the tube. But what if it isn't that? What if actually they've got an unstable arrhythmia? What if they've got a bifasicular, trifasicular block, and actually they've just gone into a transient complete heart block and had a Stokes-Adams attack and have just collapsed? You can't make that distinction by a conversation alone. They need an ECG. What if they've got critical aortic stenosis? That meant that actually very transiently they blacked out. Again, you can't make that diagnosis by talking to someone alone. And so there comes this danger with being a doctor or being a medic, because you have this bit of knowledge. And pretty much every medic I know, myself included, falls into one of two categories. The first category is this God complex type picture. So sometimes medics or doctors think, they've got some higher force where they can save lives and do all this amazing thing and diagnose what's wrong with people and treat them. And they get this sort of almost superiority complex, or this God complex, where they feel like they can do anything. And fine, some situations, maybe you are like that if you're a cardiothoracic surgeon doing all sorts of crazy stuff or whatever. But actually, it's not necessarily always a helpful mindset to have. And if you don't fall into that category, then a lot of people fall into the other category, which is this imposter syndrome. So essentially, you are a doctor, you've been through 5-6 years of medical school, you've done your foundation training maybe, you've been doing medicine for nearly 8 years, and yet every single day in your day job, you have to run everything you think by a senior, you have to run all decisions by someone else, sometimes you get told you're doing the wrong thing. You very rarely feel like a true doctor. And I think that's something that is quite inherent in the way that the training system works. You go through medical student, you become an intern, you go through your training programs, and eventually, many years down the line, you pop out as a consultant and suddenly have this seal of approval. Whereas actually, from that moment you start your medical school career, from day one, you're developing this knowledge and this amazing abilities and skill set that actually most people don't have. So the fact that a lot of people fall into one of these two categories, either the God complex type category or the imposter syndrome, can both lead to slightly dangerous outcomes. So the first example, so say someone's a bit more tending towards the God complex type thing. I know that's maybe a bit dramatic, but for sake of argument, let's go with that. And so they say a doctor sees a collapse, they run over, they announce they're a doctor, and then everyone else, every other bystander relaxes, and they settle back with their popcorn, confident in their role as observer, because there is now a doctor with the person who's collapsed. The doctor asks a few questions, and then they almost feel like a pressure not to call an ambulance because, they're a doctor, they should know what they're doing. So they don't call for an ambulance, and they ask them a few questions, and the patient's not in cardiac arrest, and they say, oh, I feel fine, actually, I just felt a bit funny for a second there and fell over, don't really know what happens. And the doctor thinks, oh yes, classic vasovagal syncope, nothing to worry about, crack on, you'll be fine. And 2 days later, they die from a fatal arrhythmia because they've gone into complete heart block and had an asystolic episode at home. So that's one picture in which it can be slightly dangerous as a doctor. And that's the kind of situation where, say the doctor hadn't been present, I can almost guarantee that a lay person who's a bystander would have gone over there and probably would have called an ambulance. So that can be the dangers of having a doctor or a medically trained person present when there's a collapse. And this is something that we absolutely need to recognize, because if we don't recognize it and we don't appreciate that there can be this tendency to do that, then it can actually mean we are putting people more at risk by our presence, which is obviously the last thing we want. The other situation, say you're more tending towards the imposter syndrome type thing, is someone collapses and there's a doctor who witnesses it, or a medical student. They think, oh my God, I'm way out of my comfort zone. I'm not in the hospital. And then they're like, actually, you know, there's loads of people around and this person's calling an ambulance and they're awake and they're talking, you know, they'll be fine. So on they walk. 30 minutes later, the ambulance still hasn't arrived because they weren't a category 1 call, because they were awake, they weren't unconscious. So the ambulance hasn't arrived yet, and the person collapses in cardiac arrest. And the doctor's no longer there. They can't be performing high quality CPR. When the ambulance arrives, they have to just crack on with doing chest compressions, and no one's there to tell them the history. And actually, if that doctor had managed to think, actually, you know what, I have got some medical training. You know, I learned how to take a history when I was a day 1 medical student. I might fill out my comfort zone, and this might not be my usual thing, but if that doctor had gone over there, taken a history, they might have then ascertained that that person was having really bad epigastric pain or chest pain with some radiation down the left arm. And actually, there was a Boots right next door, and they could have gone in there and got some aspirin and, you know, given this history to the ambulance. And then that ambulance would know that actually it sounds like a cardiac cause of collapse, and maybe they need to be going to the cardiology hospital that can do primary PCI, where they pop a balloon in to open up the arteries in the heart again, and lead to that person having a much better outcome than if the paramedics had no idea what had happened in the run-up to their collapse. So these are kind of the reasons why I think it's really important we talk about this. And hopefully you guys can appreciate some of these reasons too. So moving on, just before we move on to some of the other stuff, I want to talk about basic life support, and especially the first step highlighted in red there. And basic life support is something that is basic. Of course it is, it's in the name. But it's something that actually, when we learn a little bit of medicine, when we learn some advanced life support, when we learn other techniques such as how to feel a pulse, it can actually make us forget what basic life support is all about. And what it's about is recognizing when someone is unresponsive. You say hello, you shake their shoulders, they're not responding to you, you say, hello, can you hear me? Nothing. You know, that's unresponsive and not breathing normally. You say you're watching their breathing, you're feeling and looking and listening for 10 seconds, they're not breathing normally. That is it. That is all you need to know to start doing chest compressions. A lot of people say if you're medically trained, then you should feel a pulse as well. However, in my opinion, and having been in quite a lot of cardiac arrest now, I don't think there is much value in trying to feel a pulse, especially if you're caught out of your usual setting. So if you're in a hospital and someone has a sort of expected cardiac arrest and you're trying to feel a pulse and you're a bit more settled, fine, maybe. Although there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people disagree on whether they can feel the patient's pulse or feel their own pulse. But I can almost guarantee you that if you get caught off guard in the pre-hospital environment when you're off duty and someone claps in front of you, when you go and try to feel their pulse, you will almost guaranteed be able to feel your own pulse in your fingers. And that will make you question whether they've got a pulse or whether they don't have a pulse. It will make you forget about the importance of recognizing whether they're breathing normally, and it will lead to a delay in you starting CPR. I know because I've been there multiple times myself. I've been there at an out of hospital cardiac arrest, which I came across, and the people gathered around, they were like, oh my God, he's collapsed, what do we do? And someone was listening for breathing, and I went in there as a doctor, and I went down and tried to feel for a pulse, and I was like hesitating for ages. Like, I think I could feel a pulse, I'm not sure. And all of my concentration was used up. All of my bandwidth was focused on, could I feel a pulse or could I not? And actually that completely misses the point. If I just said, I'm not going to try and feel a pulse, I'm literally just going to, open his airway, tilt his head back and look for breathing, I would have noticed that he wasn't breathing and started CPR those few seconds earlier. And those few seconds can make all the difference. So I just want to remind people that basic life support, it needs to be basic. They're unresponsive, they're not breathing. That's the time to get help and start doing chest compressions. So just a quick reminder, first step is if you're by yourself, you call 999 and ask for an ambulance. That's the first thing you do. If you're not by yourself, then you start doing chest compressions and ask someone else to call the ambulance. And the Resource Council has released some guidance about rescue breaths. So they still advocate doing 30 chest compressions to 2 rescue breaths. And that is instead of doing compressions only CPR. And the reason is because the body has about enough oxygen in its stores to last about 3 or 4 minutes. And after that time, that's when irreversible brain damage starts to happen. So while doing CPR keeps the blood pumping round, if you're not delivering any oxygen to the person, then it's only going to do so much good. So doing the 30 to 2 is still really, really important. But what the Research Council does say is that you should only do the rescue breaths if you're trained to do the rescue breaths, because you need to be able to head tilt chin lift, blow in for about a second, see the chest rise, watch it fall, and do it again. And all of this needs to happen within 10 seconds. So you never have a more than 10-second delay in the chest compressions. So the only exceptions to doing rescue breaths are essentially if you can't, for whatever reason, maybe you've got a breathing problem, maybe you've got coronavirus or something, who knows, had to put in one reference. But essentially, unless you've got a good reason not to, or you're not trained, you should be doing rescue breaths. However, that is not to be said that if you're so paranoid about doing rescue breaths because it just really grosses you out, then obviously it's better to just start doing chest compressions and forget about the rescue breaths. Like, no one's gonna sue you, anything like that. You know, it's better to do chest compressions, do something is better than nothing. So don't let the thought of rescue breaths put you off from getting involved. So the last step on that algorithm after CPI, it says, as soon as the AED arrives, turn it on and follow the instructions. So this is a picture of an AED. For anyone who hasn't ever used one or ever seen one, what I want to reassure you of now is that they are widely available. In London, they're in every single tube station. So you're never more than, you know, a couple of minutes away from an AED at the most. And they're in lots of shopping malls, they're in airports, they're in train stations, they're all over the place. And I want to reassure you that if you've never seen an AED, it is incredibly simple. They are designed to be used by the public. And the test for medical devices when it comes to usability is, could this be used by a 12-year-old? They have to look at the language, the illustrations, and all the things. And the test for usability to meet medical device regulations is, could this be used by a 12-year-old? So if you're scared about the AED, don't be. It's very simple. You take it out, and usually there is one button, sometimes 2 on it. And essentially there's a diagram and some pads, and all you do is you follow the diagram. You open the chest, the clothes, you pop the pads on here and here, and then you essentially just press the one button, and it does everything else. It tells you when to stop pressing on the chest, it tells you when to step back, and it tells you if a shock is advised, and then the button often changes color, and it tells you to press the button to make sure no one's touching the patient. They are so simple to use. And just to remind you, they can bring that survival rate up from, say, 2 in 20 up to 70% if they're used early. And they're designed to be used by members of the public who have no training whatsoever. So don't be scared of the AEDs. So I want to now focus on some common mistakes that medics in particular make if they come across an out of hospital, out of their comfort zone collapse. First thing is, everyone likes to make an assumption. If you see that person lying on the street, lots of people make the assumption that someone else is called, someone else has checked. Another common mistake is checking for a pulse, which we've talked about already. You know, the focus is on, are they breathing normally? If not, don't bother checking a pulse, start CPR. If you start focusing on checking a pulse, you will almost definitely get sidetracked, get task fixated on trying to find a pulse, and it won't be helpful. The other thing is failing to call for help, and this comes back to that sort of, this almost expectation that if you're a medic, if you're a doctor, that you'll be able to sort it out, and actually no one needs to call an ambulance because you're there now. You know, that's absolutely not true. The ambulance, they can do OBS, they can do an ECG, they can convey someone to hospital, they can organise follow-up with a GP. There are so many more things that an ambulance can do that you can't do. And even if it is what seems to be a simple vasovagal syncope, as I've already mentioned, you know, it might not be. And that collapse provides an opportunity to then find out what caused it. And actually, if you just put it down to vasovagal syncope and it wasn't, and then they die 2 days later, then that's really not okay. It's a missed opportunity. So medics need to call for help too. Even if you're a doctor, even if you're a consultant, anaesthetist, cardiologist, whatever, you still need to call for help. It doesn't necessarily mean calling a 999 ambulance. It might mean calling 111. It might mean just that you absolutely make sure that person is going to get a GP appointment the same day or the next day. But the safest thing is always to call for an ambulance. There are two more things to mention. So open loop communication. You see it all the time, and that's in hospital, and it's also out of hospital. You see it in so many scenarios in day-to-day life where someone gets caught up on something, they go and start doing CPR and they say, can someone grab an AED? Can someone grab the adrenaline? And it is this open loop where essentially you're saying, can somebody do whatever? And essentially what that always leads to is either everyone does it or no one does it. And so it's a really big factor, especially when there are lots of human factors going on in a chaotic out of hospital situation. And that's something that is very controllable by using closed loop communication. And we'll come on to that in a little bit. The last thing is around legality. And people are often worried that they might get sued, that they might cause some damage. So it's worth being aware a little bit about the law, just to provide a bit of confidence that you are doing the right thing and that you aren't putting yourself and your own GMC license on the line. So essentially, if you are living in a country that abides by English common law type legal system, such as the UK and Australia, essentially there's a Good Samaritan law. And essentially that means if someone is acting voluntarily to help someone who is injured or ill, or someone who they believe to be injured or ill, then they are not liable to be sued. So that means if you go over to someone who is fast asleep and you shake them and you say like, hello, are you okay? And it turns out actually they're fine. They say, yeah, what are you doing? And then they try and sue you for assault. You can't be sued because you are trying to help someone who you genuinely believed was ill. And that's just one example. The same thing is, if someone is in what you believe to be cardiac arrest, and it turns out it wasn't quite a cardiac arrest, maybe it was like an opiate overdose, and you've started doing chest compressions on them and you break a few ribs, like, you're fine from a legal point of view. Like, it's not an issue, you're not going to get sued. The other place where you need to be aware of the law, I suppose, is in countries where there's a civil law type legal system, such as in most countries in the EU, for example, in France. And in these countries, actually, they have a law called a duty to respond, a duty to help, which means that actually it's a legal requirement that anyone coming across someone who is ill or injured stops to help, not just if you're a medic, but anyone. So again, in those situations, if you don't help, actually you're putting yourself more on the line than if you do help. So at this point, I've talked a lot about why I think it's important and some of the common mistakes people make. So I want to just give you 4 tools that you can use, and they're 4 very simple tools, and they are basic. They don't really require any sort of memorization of numbers or facts or medicines or anything like that. But they are the 4 most useful tools that you can remember to actually be useful in these situations. So the first one is Dr. ABC. So danger, response, airway, breathing, CPR, or recovery position. So you always check for danger first. You check to see if they've got a response. You open their airway with a head tilt chin lift. If they're breathing, you put them in recovery position. If they're not breathing, you do CPR. So nice and easy. Always call for help. It's easier to remember that than to try and decide on each situation, should I call for help, should I not? Make it your default position to always call for help, because that will make you feel less scared about calling 999 or whatever. If that's your default position, then it can be every once in a blue moon where you think actually they really don't need any help. But as I've already said, you can't really make those diagnoses by conversation alone. That was on Kilimanjaro, couldn't resist. The third is it's an acronym for taking a very focused pre-hospital history. And this is the same sort of history that the air ambulance guys will use, the same history that I'll use on an expedition if there's an emergency, and same that the paramedics will use in case of emergency. And it's a really, really useful acronym because essentially it gets you all of the information that you need that will influence how you manage that patient in as quick a time frame as possible. So firstly, it's just the symptoms. You know, what can you feel right now? Like, is your head hurting? Do you have pain anywhere? Is your neck sore? Do you feel sick? You know, are you dizzy, confused? These are your symptoms. And then you'll notice it's very different from your usual medical history, where you do a history of presenting complaint and past medical history, all of these things. Because the next thing is allergies. And so you want to know, is that person allergic to morphine? Are they allergic to penicillin? And it's really useful to get this out immediately, because 5 minutes later, if they've got a dirty wound, the paramedics might be wanting to give them a shot of comoxiclav, for example. So if you're able to get that information that they're allergic to penicillin, then that's very useful information. It guides the management. Next thing is medications. And again, it's useful information because learning about the medications will tell you a bit about their past medical history, and it will tell you about the injuries they might be likely to have. For example, if someone says they are on warfarin or rivaroxaban or apixaban, you know that that person is a much higher risk of having intracranial bleeding if they've hit their head. You know they're more likely to have possibly a clot in their legs or lungs, or maybe they've got a funny heart rhythm. It tells you a lot about the patient, but it guides management as well. Then if they haven't become unconscious by this point, then you can take the past medical history, find out some background, find out if they're pregnant, ask when their last meal is, because this has an impact on whether, if they need to do an anesthetic, whether they will pretty much always use rapid sequence induction now, but it's useful to know. And then the last bit is the events leading up to now. So what's been going on the last half an hour, couple of days. So it's called the sample history. You might also hear it referred to as the ample history, which just misses out the symptoms at the beginning. But I really like the sample history. And again, it's useful to have these simple tools, because if something happens and it catches you off guard, you're on your way to the park or whatever, all you need to remember is Dr. ABC sample. That's all you need to remember at this point, and call for help. Fourth one is closed loop communication. So that is how you do things. So instead of saying, can someone call 999, you look someone in the eye and you say, can you call 999 and tell me when you've done it? And can you go and find an AED and bring it back? And can you go and do X, Y, Z? It's all about giving direct instructions to someone and asking them to let you know when you've done it. It closes the loop. The trouble is, if you say, you start doing CPR and say, can someone call an ambulance? Then everyone looks around and either no one calls it or everyone calls it. And it's one of these parts of the field of study known as human factors that has a really massive impact on how well a case runs, a scenario runs, and has a really big impact on the outcome for the patient. So essentially, you've got two principles to remember there. You've got always call for help and use closed loop communication, and you've got two acronyms to remember, two mnemonics to remember, Dr. ABC and sample. So it's very simple. There's two techniques, two memory joggers to remind you what to do in those situations. And with Dr. ABC and sample, you cannot go wrong, and you'll be very useful if you ever come across these situations as a medic. So with that all in mind, we are going to look at some of these scenarios. So in a minute, we'll use the polling tool so that you can answer the questions. And hopefully these will just allow you to prepare and think about what you might do in some of these situations. So case-based discussion 1, you're doing a shop at the supermarket, you're excited about getting some beers to go down to the park, and you hear a loud thud. An elderly man next to you has just collapsed. What do you do? So you say it's safe to approach, you've ticked off your D. You shout at him and shake his shoulders, but there's no response. That's your R of the Dr. ABC. You tilt his head back like this, and you count to 10. And you think he might have taken a breath, but you're not entirely sure. What do you do next? Let me get the polling up. So launch poll. So hopefully that should be working. Do you A, shout for help, B, check for a pulse, C, start chest compressions, D, dial 999, E, give 5 rescue breaths? And I'll just give you a second to answer questions there. Great, so that's most of you voted there, so I'll share the results there. So as you can see, 73% of you said shout for help, and only 14% of you said start chest compressions. And this is a little bit of a trick question, but if you're thinking about the scenario you're in a supermarket and there's lots of people around, actually the best thing to do is you've identified the fact that he is in cardiac arrest. What you want to do first is start chest compressions. You just want to get on the chest as early as you can. And yeah, you can shout for help at the same time. You could say shout for help first, but you wouldn't want to delay starting chest compressions in order to shout for help. It does say that in the algorithm, so I'll give it to you that is a bit of a trick question, but it just makes you think a bit about it. And you have to be a bit realistic with these algorithms. So it says, you know, first step, dial 999, call for help. Second step is to start chest compressions. That algorithm is actually designed if you're a solo responder and you're by yourself. And so that's the reason they're thinking that is because if you start chest compressions, that means you're not then able to dial 999 and get help. So if you're by yourself, you want to dial 999 first, get help, make sure it's on the way, and then you're starting your chest compressions. Ideally, what you do is hit 999, put it on speakerphone, and start chest compressions. So in this situation, actually, you're surrounded by people, you're in a supermarket. The best thing to do, to be honest, is to start chest compressions immediately. And while you're doing it, you call for help. Okay. So moving on. So you start chest compressions and then you shout for help. Maybe do them at the same time. A crowd appears. And so what should you say next? So moving on to question 2 on the poll. So first response is, can someone call 999? Can someone find me an AED now? Or look someone in the eyes and say, can you call 999? Tell me when it's done. You look someone in the eyes and say, go and ask a member of staff where the nearest AED is and bring it back here as quick as you can. And you look someone in the eyes and ask if they are happy to give rescue breaths. Or option E, which is B, C, and D. Great, and the results are coming in. So I'll hit stop when it gets to 75% of you. And there we go. So launch the results, show results. So excellent. Most of you there said option B, C, D, and that is right. You need to be saying all of these things. And the point of this question is to highlight the difference between open communication and closed loop communication. And pretty much all of you identified that the right thing to do is to use closed loop communication. So you don't want to say, can someone call 999, someone find me an AED now? Because as I mentioned before, that might mean that no one does it, might mean that everyone does it. And it doesn't really help you know, it doesn't give you any clarity in your mind that what you need to be done is getting done. So these other 3 options, they're all things that you should be thinking about doing. You're starting CPR, say, can you call 999, tell me when it's done? And you look someone in the eyes and say, go and find a member of staff and find where the nearest AED is and bring it back here as quick as you can. And then only 2 people from that crowd have got specific jobs and they know exactly what they're doing. It's a very clear command. And then you're looking someone in the eyes and asking if they're happy to give rescue breaths. They might well say no, and that's absolutely fine. But there might be somebody then says, no, actually they can't, but I can. Someone might chip in at that point. And if there's no one that is happy to do that, then you can ask if someone's happy to do chest compressions and take over from yourself. That will allow you to do the rescue breaths yourself. So common mistakes in this scenario. So people often say, because he's collapsed, and you look down at him and you think, oh, maybe he took a breath. People often think about checking for a pulse. And I was really glad to see that on the results, pretty much nobody said to try a pulse check. And I think I hammered that home, and it is probably the most common thing medics do is they see something, they see someone collapse, and they go and try and feel a pulse because that's what they do on the TV shows. That's what they do in the movies. The reality is, you know, you can, but it's just going to distract you. It's going to take away from your focus on being on, are they breathing normally? And if the answer is no, you should be starting chest compressions. It's really black and white like You're not gonna do someone damage by starting chest compressions, and if you got it wrong, they'll just wake up and be like, piss off, get off me, that hurts. The other things about the open loop communication, and it's great, only 3% of you said, can someone call 999? But I can guarantee that in this situation, probably 93% of you would say, can someone call 999 and find an AED? So it's really important to think about this so that we are aware of what our tendencies are in these situations. So this is the second scenario, one that I'm sure many people would have found themselves in multiple times. So you are walking down the street and you see someone who appears to be homeless and they're unconscious, face down in an awkward position, running late for work. Do you stop to check he is okay? So let me get that question up and launch poll. So option A, no, he's probably asleep and you don't want to disturb him. I've definitely thought that. No, there are loads of people around. Surely someone has checked on him by now. Again, I'm definitely guilty. I've thought that before. C, no, you don't have time as you're late for work. D, yes, you look from afar to make sure he's breathing. E, you go over to him and you ask if he is okay. What do you guys reckon? And I think there's going to be quite clearly a disparity here between what you would actually do and what you think the right answer is. And as I said, I'm guilty of that myself sometimes, but it's something that I've learned, by thinking about it and thinking through the potential consequences, it's quite easy to see what the right answer should be. And I'm glad to see that most people here have said that you would go over to him and ask if he is okay. And I take the point that you could look from afar to make sure he is breathing, but that doesn't tell you much more than he is breathing or he's dead. It doesn't give you any more information than that. And actually, he might be breathing now, but if he's completely unrousable, completely unconscious, then you're going to be calling 999. And you can't tell that when you look from afar and say he's breathing. So you look from afar, you're like, yeah, he's breathing. Great, I'm going to crack on with my day. Whereas if you went over to him and you shook him and you said, okay, he's breathing, but he's completely unconscious, and you called 999, and then maybe 10 minutes later, he stops breathing because he's had a massive opiate overdose and at least helps on the way rather than it being ignored and he's lying there not breathing. So I know that would be the tempting thing to do. It feels like a nice compromise, like you're not disturbing him, you're not, getting too involved. You're just checking from afar. Is he responding? Is he breathing? Is he not? But that's not really the right answer. You need to go over to him and ask if he's okay. And what's the worst thing that's going to happen? He's going to wake up and be like, "Oh, he's off. I'm trying to sleep." But that's not a big deal. You just say, "Sorry, sir," and you crack on with your day, knowing that you've done the right thing. You ensure there's nothing dangerous in the way. There's no needles. You go over and you ask if he's okay, but there is no response. You shake him, but you are still unable to gain a response. However, he is breathing. What do you do next? So launching question 4 now. So do you leave him alone? He's breathing, so it's fine. Do you put him in the recovery position and call for an ambulance? Start chest compression, give rescue breaths, or do you pour cold water on him to see if it wakes him up? And there are a few people who are suggesting pouring cold water on him, which is always good to see. Yeah, I'm gonna end that one there. I think pretty much everyone has got that right. So it's absolutely right. You put him in the recovery position and you call for a 999 ambulance. There were 3 people who said to leave him alone. He's breathing, so it's fine. But as I just mentioned, he might be breathing, but he's unresponsive. He's therefore a U on the AVPU of alert, voice, pain, or unresponsive. And this isn't a good position to be in. There might be a whole load of reasons. He might be very drunk. He might have taken an opiate overdose. But these aren't excuses to not call for help. These are still things that could kill the person. So absolutely not. You shouldn't leave him alone because he's breathing. You shouldn't start chest compressions. He's breathing. Fine. You could say, I should have added he is breathing normally rather than he is breathing abnormally. But in this situation, I said he's breathing. So yeah, you don't necessarily want to start chest compressions. And if you're feeling really mean, you could pour some cold water on him, but that might get you punched. So the common thing, well, the things to think about with this situation is to remember your Dr. ABC, and the D is for danger. So if you're going to approach someone who's lying on the floor unconscious, there is a possibility that they might have been injecting drugs. And so you want to make sure you're not going to kneel down onto a needle, for example, or as I rather annoyingly did once, and just knelt right in a puddle of wee from the person who lost consciousness. So always look where you're putting your knees and your hands. So remember the D for Dr. ABC. And second principle is always call for help. The assumptions here is you walk past assuming someone else has checked, or you fail to call for help. So these are the assumptions that a lot of people make and could lead to his death if we don't involve ourselves. So the last case-based discussion, so trying to wrap things up, is this one. So you are driving down a country lane, and as you go around a corner, you have to slam on the brakes as a cyclist is lying in the road, having come off their bike. What do you do next? And here we'll be going on to question 5. So it was lucky as you were able to brake quickly as he's just around the blind corner, and as you get out of your car, you can see he is clearly unconscious. You don't have any passengers in your car, and there are no other people around. So what should your first next step be? Do you go over to the cyclist and to assess him? Do you call 999? Do you get the emergency triangle from your car and put it in the road the other side of the blind corner? Or do you carry on driving? You're sure someone will come along soon. And that is quite a lot of you having answered now. So end that and share the results there. So 15% of you said to go over to the cyclist to assess him. So imagine that's your next step. You go over to the cyclist and you assess him, and as you bend down to ask if he's okay, another car comes flying around the corner and runs both of you over, and you both die. Not particularly helpful. You can call 999. Trouble is, you won't have a clue what to say to 999 at this point because you haven't assessed them. All you'll be able to say is someone's fallen off their bike, and they'll ask you, is he breathing? And you'll say, I don't know. And they'll say, is he injured? And you say, I don't know. And while you're having this phone call, someone might come flying around the corner and run you over as well. So again, you want to remember your basics, and it doesn't matter what situation you're in, it always comes down to the basics. And the basic one to remember is Dr. ABC. So danger. This person is just round the blind corner. You just have to slam on your brakes, and you're now in that same position. So the first thing you need to do is try and ensure scene safety. And this comes back to any trauma situation, any situation in general. You know, the first thing you need to do is make sure the scene is safe, because otherwise you might get injured just as badly as the person you're trying to help. So pretty much every car has a red emergency triangle in it, or well, not every car, but you should have one in your car. If you don't, then you should think about getting one. So you want to put that at least 30, 40, 50 meters behind the car, and you know, up the road before the road gets to you, if you see what I mean. So you give people enough time to see the triangle, advance slowly, and then see actually there's something going on. And that ensures that the scene is safe. And after that is when you can move on to the next step. So you put the emergency triangle around the corner, sure the scene is safe. You approach the cyclist, and he is actually conscious, but he appears in severe pain. What should your next step be? So moving on to question 6 on the poll. So you put him in the recovery position. You ask him to sit up, tell him don't move, and you call 999, or you help him up and back onto his bike. Excellent. So a few of you voted there, so we will share those results. So most of you said option C, which is the correct answer. You tell them not to move and you call 999. A few of you also said to put them in the recovery position, and this is a little bit of a trick question again, because this is a trauma patient. So generally, if someone's complaining of severe pain and trauma, you obviously want to know where that is, but he's got a good mechanism. He's come off his bike on a road. He might have injured his neck. So you don't really want to be moving them if at all possible. So putting him in the recovery position might make a neck injury worse. So in this case, you tell him not to move and you call 999. So you call 999, the emergency services tell you they're on the way. What's your next step? So moving on to question 7, second to last question. Do you then put him in the recovery position? Do you make casual conversation with him? Do you drive off as an ambulance is coming? Or do you take a sample history while you hold his head using manual inline stabilization if you are trained? So if you are wondering what that is, it's essentially where you hold the head with your hands, you kneel down behind them and you hold the head essentially like that, just to keep it still, to make sure they're not moving their head around. And if there is any spinal fracture there, it just helps keep it stable. And all of you have definitely got the right answer there, because you've remembered to take your sample history. That's the second memory jog you need to remember. The second 2, I'm only giving you 2 things to remember here. That's Dr. ABC and sample. So you take your sample history and it reveals he has a severe headache, severe pain in his neck, severe abdominal pain, and he takes warfarin. Just at that point, the paramedics arrive and he blacks out, losing consciousness. What does this information tell them? And question 8, launch poll. And just as you answer that, I'm going to run to the lead because I'm absolutely bursting. I'll be right back.
How's everyone doing today? There we go.
Alrighty. Excellent. Most of you have answered. Sorry about that. It's trouble with having 1,000 coffees in a day. So, end the poll, share the results. And so it tells you all of the above. That is exactly right. So he has a severe headache. He's just fallen off his bike. It maybe tells you that he's got some bleeding going on his head and he has a high risk because he takes warfarin, which is a blood thinner. Severe pain in his neck makes you think maybe he's got some spinal trauma as well. And severe abdominal pain in the case of trauma makes you think of bleeding. Again, higher risk because of the warfarin. So essentially what that means is that the paramedics now know that this person requires advanced trauma care. He might require neurosurgery, he might require spinal surgery, he might require abdominal surgery. And so with, in case you're particularly interested in trauma, if you've got a high risk of internal bleeding and you're becoming unconscious, it might suggest that you're becoming hypovolemic from internal bleeding. And so he might require some blood transfusions, some tranexamic acid to help reduce the bleeding. So learning points for this one is remember your Dr. ABC. Again, the biggest temptation when you come across a situation like this in real life, and again, I've been there, is when you just get out the car and you run straight over to the person lying in the road, forgetting all about scene safety. And I've done that. I was on a dual carriageway coming back into London after a weekend down in Brighton, and a guy fell off his moped literally in front of me, the other side of the road. And pretty much the first thing I did was just slam on the brakes and swerve onto the basically pavement. Really stupid, because that is the first thing you think. You're like, oh my God, that guy just launched himself off his moped. But again, that's not particularly smart. You need to be thinking danger first, do everything in the safest possible way. So, indicate, pull over, look before you cross the road and go in a safe way, because you don't want to land yourself as another casualty. Again, avoid moving trauma patients unless they are actively vomiting and choking as a result. That's pretty much the only reason why you might turn a trauma patient. And if you do, again, you want to be trying to make sure that they don't move their neck in that situation. And last thing is to remember your sample history. So just because someone is conscious now doesn't mean they will stay conscious until help arrives. So every single second you are with them as a medically trained person, you can be getting valuable information in the form of a sample history that could really have an impact on how that person is managed by the paramedics when they do arrive. So just a quick summary of the things you need to remember. Dr. ABC, always check for danger first. you check for a response, and then you're opening the airway, checking for breathing. You're not checking for pulse, and then you're starting CPR early. Always call for help. Make that your default position. It doesn't matter if you're a doctor, it doesn't matter if you're a consultant or you're a lay person or a medical student. I don't care what you are, just make it your default position to always call for help, because you can never tell for sure whether someone has just had a simple faint or whether there's something more sinister going on. And so that is a very good place to start. You know, if you think in your mind, there's someone who's collapsed, I'm going to call for help. Like, it takes away the decision, it takes away the pressure on you trying to make the right decision. Remember your sample history. So that's signs and symptoms, allergies, medications, past medical history or pregnancy, last meal and events leading up to now, and closed loop communication. So this is the last slide, I think, and it's a picture I took also in Pakistan, and it's just kind of a random picture, but I quite liked it. Essentially, it's all about preparation leads to success. If you fail to prepare, you're preparing to fail. So by the fact that you've turned up for today's lecture, hopefully that will have made you think about what you do in some of these situations, hopefully giving you some tools that will help you if you ever find yourself in one of these situations unexpectedly. So some useful resources. Resus.org.uk has loads of really good resources. It's got some good information on some articles on how to save lives with CPR. And then there's the Restart a Heart Day, which is 16th of October this year. And that's when there's nationwide teaching. If you are already basic life support trained, then get involved, help train other people how to do CPR. And if you're not, then think about getting yourself trained up on that particular day. And that is it. So I will be absolutely taking any questions now about this topic or about expedition medicine, whatever you want to ask, fire away. And don't forget that to get your certificate, you need to fill in the feedback form, and you just scan that QR code up at the top right there, and that will then lead to you getting your certificate. So hopefully that was vaguely useful. Sorry, it's a little bit different to my other types of talks, but hopefully you enjoyed it, found something useful out of that. And if there are any questions, fire away.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Just before you dive into your Q&A, that was really, really insightful. I found that super useful. I'm sure everyone else did as well. So thank you so much for your time today. It was brilliant.
You're very welcome. Azim, you're very, very quiet.
Yeah, that's what. Okay, one sec. Can you hear me?
Ooh, yeah, that was loud.
Sorry, I was just saying thank you, basically, if you didn't hear any of that.
Thank you very much. I've had to turn the volume down a bit now.
Okay, I'll disappear.
So I'll just have a flick through the chat and see if there's any. Wow, there's a lot of chat there. Sorry, I couldn't look at both at the same time. Trying to figure out where the questions are. So there's quite a lot of questions coming up about the pulse. And yes, so I'll talk about taking a pulse again. I've already talked about it and explained it, but essentially part of the algorithm, if you're medically trained or thing of advanced life support, is, you know, look, listen and feel. So you're looking for breath movements in the chest rise, you're feeling for the feel of breath on your cheek, and you're listening for any breath sounds. And they say if you are trained to take a pulse, then you can feel for carotid pulse at the same time. So you do that by lifting the chin, feeling for a pulse at the same time with the other fingers, and feeling for pulse. However, all of the evidence shows, and there have been numerous studies comparing it with medical students, lay people, consultant anaesthetists, in controlled resuscitation scenarios in hospital and in out of hospital cardiac arrest situations. And all of them show that people cannot agree on whether they can or can't feel a pulse. For example, that is why previously they used to advocate doing 3-point pulse checks. So that would be where someone feels a pulse in the carotid and someone feels a pulse at each femoral artery by 3 separate people, because they think actually maybe that will increase the likelihood of someone feeling a pulse. In reality, what happens is, and you know, you will see that time and time again in hospital situations, is that someone says, oh, I think I've got a pulse, and someone else says, I can't feel a pulse. And then you spend another 5 seconds where everyone's like, is that a pulse? And then they're like, I think it's my pulse. And they're faffing around. And all of this is wasting time. It doesn't achieve anything in the out of hospital situation where you don't have any monitoring, anything like that. You know, it's a complete waste of time. And what it does do is it completely shifts your focus away from the important thing, is this person conscious and are they breathing normally? So hopefully that gives you some indication. And as I say, I've been there myself, I've experienced it, I've felt that task fixation of trying to feel a pulse leading to delay in your other decision making. And the reality is it's not important. Fine. Where are we? There's so much chat in here. I was trying to find the question, sorry. Once an AED arrives, would you start giving a shock, or do you check first if the rhythm is shockable or unshockable? So yeah, someone has already answered. The AED tells you exactly what you do. And once you get the AED, you literally press the one button on it, it turns it on, and it will tell you attach the pads. It will then say stop compressions, analyzing rhythm, and then it will say shock advised or shock not advised. It will tell you whether to carry on chest compressions or not. It tells you everything. You don't need to do anything except put the pads on and press the buttons when it tells you to. Do you need informed consent if there is his or her family there? It's a tricky one, but no, essentially you don't need informed consent. The only reason why that wouldn't be the case is if the family actively went and said, do not do CPR, he has a do not attempt resuscitation order, he has a DNA CPR form, and they have it there on hand to be able to show it to you to prove it. Otherwise, the more dangerous thing is to assume without proof. And as I mentioned before, there's the Good Samaritan Act, which means that you won't be liable if you are acting in your what you believe to be that person's best interests. When giving rescue breaths without an ambu bag or similar devices, you're essentially exhaling mostly carbon dioxide. Is this helpful to a patient in hypoxia? So when you exhale, you aren't exhaling mostly carbon dioxide. The exhaled carbon dioxide is probably about 4 or 5% when you're exhaling, and room air has 21% oxygen. When you're exhaling, there is still a decent amount of oxygen in your exhaled breath. It's maybe between 10 and 15%, and that amount of oxygen is still better than no oxygen at all, and it generates that air movement into the lungs and helps provide some oxygen, which is better than nothing. So it is still helpful to a patient in hypoxia, and that is represented in also the child and adult, the children's basic life support, where the primary cause of cardiac arrest is hypoxia, and the algorithm starts with 5 rescue breaths before chest compressions. And someone has written just below that 15% oxygen, 5% CO2. Fine.
Nathan, do you want to take one more? I'm wary of the time you've been.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, it's quite hard to pick out questions here.
Yeah, no.
Let me scroll down to the bottom and see if there's anything there. I can't even find any questions at the moment.
Let's see if I can find one. What are the indications for stopping chest compressions? I mean, there's really 2 on, isn't there?
Yeah, so the indications for stopping chest compressions is essentially signs of life. So it depends on what sort of monitoring you have. And in the pre-hospital situation, if you don't have any monitoring, it is just that. It is, do they look like someone who's alive? Have they started breathing by themselves? Are they now moving? Is there some obvious sign of life? That is pretty much the only reason you stop CPR. If all you have is yourself and the patient and you're doing chest compressions and rescue breaths. So if they start speaking to you, they wake up, they move around, they start breathing for themselves, that's a sign of life. If you then have an AED and at the 2-minute pulse check, it says, no shock advised, and they show some signs of life, then again, that's a reason to stop. If you can't see any signs of life, carry on. The other thing that's considered a sign of life in the hospital setting is when you have something called Untitled Co2. So that monitors and measures the carbon dioxide being exhaled by the patient. And if that usually hovers around sort of the 2 mark in cardiac arrest, if that suddenly jumps up to say 4 or 5, that suggests that the heart has suddenly started pumping blood around the body more effectively, respiration is happening again in the literal sense, meaning carbon dioxide is being produced. And that sudden sharp rise in end-tidal CO2 can also be a sign of life, which can prompt you to stop CPR. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I guess out of hospital as well, if you're too exhausted and no one can take over, then you'd have to stop as well. But yeah, great.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fine. I guess we'll call it a day there. Thank you so much again, once again, Nathan, for your time. Really insightful stuff. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did learn a lot as well. And yeah, take care, everyone. Please fill out the feedback form. Follow Nathan on Instagram, as you can see there, expedition_doctor. If you have any interest in emergency medicine or medicine in general, or expedition medicine, really, you'll learn a lot. Well, I've learned a lot since I started following him a few months ago. So yeah, have a wonderful day, and hopefully see you tomorrow, I think, for our OSCE webinar, which Schwabe is doing.